She had always been different, and her people never let her forget it. From the moment she could stand, towering over children her age, whispers followed her everywhere. Her size was more than unusual, it was unwanted. Where others saw beauty in delicate frames and graceful forms, she grew broader, stronger, and taller than even the fiercest warriors. What should have been strength became shame, for her people valued fragility as a symbol of love. In every gaze, every whisper, she felt the weight of their judgment. She was too much, too large, too big for love. As the seasons passed, that judgment hardened into cruelty. When she walked through the gathering halls, conversations faltered, and suitors who once laughed with her in youth turned away in adulthood. The elders reinforced the belief, speaking words that carved deeper than any blade. To them, size meant imbalance, a failure to embody the soft grace their culture worshipped. Her very body stood as proof that she did not belong. At night she lay awake, wondering why strength, which should have been a gift, was treated as a curse. The day of her rejection arrived not with surprise, but inevitability. During the choosing ceremony, when mates were paired, her name was spoken aloud. The silence that followed pierced her soul. No one stepped forward, not a single warrior nor hunter, not even the meek who might have been desperate. The elders, voices cold as stone, declared what had always been whispered. She was unfit for companionship. She stood alone, a towering figure among a sea of smaller forms, marked forever as an outcast. Shame burned across her skin, and though her heart cried for someone to speak against them, no voice rose. That night, beneath an alien sky streaked with stars, she walked away. No farewells, no possessions, there was nothing worth carrying. The wilderness awaited, filled with dangers her people feared, but she welcomed its silence more than the scorn of her tribe. Each step carried both sorrow and defiance. They had said she was too big for love, and so she would live alone, surviving on her own strength. Yet beneath the bitterness, a fragile ember remained, a question she could not smother. Was there truly no one, anywhere, who could see her differently? In solitude, she hunted and endured, her massive frame finally serving the purpose it was meant for, resilience. She became a shadow in the wilds, the tale of the giantess whispered among those who stayed behind. But loneliness gnawed at her, deeper than hunger. She had all the strength her people lacked, yet none of the closeness they cherished. She longed for a touch that did not recoil, a gaze that did not weigh her against fragile ideals. She buried the longing, convincing herself it was weakness, but still it remained. The nights were the worst. In the silence, memories returned unbidden. Laughter from her youth, the warmth of belonging before judgment hardened into exile, the dream of one day being chosen, held, loved. Each memory reminded her of what had been stolen. She pressed them down, locking them away like scars she dared not reopen, but the ache never vanished. Instead, it lived within her, a quiet shadow that walked beside her under the stars. Though she believed she had left her people behind forever, their words followed her, etched into her very being. Every river she crossed, every mountain she climbed, their condemnation echoed. Too big for love. She did not fight the words anymore. She carried them, heavy as chains, yet strangely, they became part of her strength. She survived because of them, endured because of them. But deep inside, she wondered how long she could walk alone before the chains crushed even her towering frame. And so she wandered, an exile in both body and spirit, bound by the judgment of her people, yet sustained by the faintest hope that somewhere, beyond the reach of their voices, there might be someone who saw her not as a curse, but as someone worthy. That hope was fragile, hidden, but it refused to die. The crash came like thunder across the wilderness, a roar of tearing metal and burning sky. She turned toward the sound instinctively, muscles coiled, eyes sharp. Fire lit the horizon where something had fallen, a streak of light that did not belong to this world. Curiosity pulled her forward. She had seen storms split mountains and beasts roar and challenge, but nothing like this. Her people feared the sky, whispering of omens and punishments, yet she walked toward it unflinching, guided by the silence that had ruled her exile. Among the wreckage, she found movement. A figure smaller than even the smallest of her kind staggered from the twisted remains. Fragile, delicate, but alive. She expected fear when his eyes lifted to her towering form. Instead, he froze, not in terror, but in wonder. He looked at her as though she were not a monster, but something rare, something extraordinary. She braced for the recoil, the disgust she knew too well, but it never came. His gaze lingered, steady and unbroken, and for the first time in her life, she felt seen without shame. The human tried to speak, words carried on a broken tongue she could not fully understand. The sound was strange, clipped, yet his gestures bridged the gap. He touched his chest, spoke a name, repeated it until she knew it belonged to him. He pointed to her, waiting, as if asking. It startled her, for no one had ever asked who she was, only declared what she was not. With hesitation, she gave her name, heavy on her lips, and though he could not shape it perfectly, he tried. That effort struck her harder than any insult ever had. He should have feared her size, yet instead he admired it. With every look, every word, he carried none of the contempt her people had poured into her. Where they saw deformity, he spoke with awe, calling her strong, graceful, magnificent. She wanted to deny it, to push the words away, but they clung to her like warmth in the cold. The chains of exile did not vanish, but for the first time they loosened. She chose not to leave him to die. He was fragile, vulnerable against the wilderness she had mastered. Predators prowled the shadows, storms carved through the mountains, and alone he would not last. She built shelter with her hands, shared food she had hunted, guarded his small frame through the night. In return, he mended what he could from the wreck, his nimble fingers shaping tools and fire from scraps she would have discarded. He shared knowledge of distant stars, places her people never dared to imagine, and in his voice there was no mockery, only eagerness to share. Nights stretched into days, and survival wove them together. She, who had believed herself destined to walk in silence, now found herself listening to his stories. His language, though broken between them, carried meaning she felt more than understood. He spoke of humans who loved not because of sameness, but because of difference, who saw beauty in strength as much as in fragility. These were ideas her people would laugh at, but in his tone there was no jest. He believed every word. The more she listened, the more the ember within her stirred. Where once she questioned if she could ever be worthy of companionship, now she wondered if perhaps she always had been, only measured by the wrong eyes. Each gesture of his reinforced it. The way he never flinched at her size, the way he leaned on her strength without shame, the way he smiled as if her presence itself was comfort. She found herself watching him in turn, not with suspicion but with something unfamiliar. He was small, yet his spirit carried weight greater than his frame. He moved with a determination that reminded her of storms, fragile in appearance, yet unstoppable in force. It fascinated her, unsettled her, but also soothed her. In his presence, the wilderness no longer felt like exile. It felt like a place where two outcasts from different worlds could stand side by side. When she lay awake at night, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing, she realized that for the first time, her thoughts of tomorrow were not heavy with dread. They were curious, hopeful even. Her people had told her she was too big for love, too wrong for companionship, destined to be alone. Yet this human, this fragile being who had fallen from the sky, looked at her and saw something entirely different. He saw perfection where others saw shame. He saw worth where others declared none existed. And slowly, beneath the stars, she began to wonder if he was right. Together they endured storms that split the skies and predators that stalked the wilds. His body was small, fragile against the dangers of her world, but he never shrank from them. Instead, he faced each challenge with a determination that reminded her of fire, brief yet unyielding. She, with her strength and size, shielded him from harm, and he, with his cleverness, found solutions she would never have considered. Side by side, they forged survival, and in the rhythm of that struggle, something unspoken grew between them. He shared stories of his people when the nights were long and silence pressed too heavily. Tales of humans who fell in love not because they mirrored one another, but because they were different. One fierce, the other gentle, one strong, the other fragile, each part complementing the other. She listened, at first doubtful, because her people had taught her the opposite. To them, beauty was sameness, balance found only in pairs that matched. But in his words, there was no doubt, no hesitation. He believed difference was not a flaw, but a gift. She could not understand how he looked at her with such certainty, but she could feel the truth of it every time his eyes met hers. The more he spoke, the more she felt something shift inside her. Where she once saw herself as cursed, she began to see glimpses of what he described. When she caught her reflection in the water, instead of turning away in shame, she wondered if perhaps there was power in her form, grace in her strength. His voice had planted seeds of doubt, not doubt in herself, but in the cruel words that had defined her. Slowly, painfully, she began to let those words loosen their grip. They shared laughter, though neither fully spoke the other's tongue. A gesture, a clumsy attempt at her name, a smile that needed no translation, all of it built a bond stronger than words. She found herself waiting for his voice, listening for the cadence of his stories, feeling a warmth that went beyond survival. He was not simply a companion in hardship. He was something rarer, something she had thought impossible, someone who saw her without disdain. One night, when the firelight flickered across his face, he called her perfect. The word struck her harder than any blade. Perfect. She tried to deny it, shaking her head, but he repeated it, steady, unwavering. For her people, she had always been too much, too large, too imposing, too unworthy of love. Yet here was someone who saw no flaw, no excess, only perfection. It made her chest ache in a way she had never known, and for the first time, she believed it might not be a lie. That belief transformed her. She carried herself differently, not as the shamed exile who crept through shadows, but as someone who finally understood her worth. Her steps grew surer, her voice steadier, her presence no longer hidden. She began to realize that exile had not been the end, but the beginning of a path that led her here, to this fragile being who had shown her a truth stronger than any tradition. The wilderness, once a place of isolation, now became a place of belonging. Hunting was no longer just survival, it was an act of care when she returned with food for him. Guarding the shelter was no longer duty, it was purpose, because his safety mattered more than her own. Every task, every gesture, carried meaning she had never experienced before. She had always believed her strength was a burden. Now it felt like a gift, one meant to protect something precious. Her nights changed as well. Where once loneliness had gnawed at her, now there was comfort in knowing he was near. His breathing steadied her, his presence eased the shadows. She did not need to reach for him, did not need to touch, because the bond between them was already woven tighter than any embrace. It lived in the unspoken, in the way he smiled when she returned from a hunt, in the way he trusted her to keep him safe, in the way he never once recoiled from her sighs. For the first time, she no longer feared the future. She had thought herself cursed to walk alone, but now, she imagined a life that stretched beyond survival. A life where strength and love could coexist, where she was not too big for anything, but exactly as she was meant to be. She had found a place not in the acceptance of her people, but in the eyes of a single human who saw her as more than enough. But peace never lasts. The wilderness had ears, and the movements of strangers do not go unnoticed. One morning, distant figures emerged from the trees, marked by familiar shapes and voices she had tried to forget. Her people had come, and with them, the past she thought she had left behind. They came with the same eyes that had once condemned her, eyes filled with judgment and disdain. Warriors stood in front, elders behind, their voices sharp as they demanded she step away from the outsider. To them, the human was a trespasser, an infection that did not belong, and her choice to shelter him was proof of her shame. They mocked her again, the same words repeated as though years had not passed. Too large, too unworthy, too broken for love. Their cruelty had not changed, but she had. Where once she would have lowered her head and accepted their verdict, she stood tall, every breath steady, every word sharpened by the fire the human had kindled within her. She told them their judgments no longer bound her, that her worth was not theirs to define. Her voice rolled like thunder through the clearing, and though they jeered, none could deny its strength. The human, small beside her, lifted his voice as well. Though they could barely understand his tongue, the intent was clear. He saw her not as a curse, but as perfection. His words carried no hesitation, no fear, and in their echo, she felt unbreakable. The warriors moved forward, intent on driving the human away, but she stepped between them, her size no longer a source of shame but a shield. They challenged her strength, and she answered without hesitation. Her presence alone forced them back, not through brute force alone, but through the unshakable certainty she carried. They could see it in her stance, in the way she no longer flinched beneath their judgment. The outcast they had cast aside was gone, replaced by someone who no longer needed their approval to stand tall. A murmur spread through the gathered crowd. Some eyes, once filled with scorn, now carried uncertainty. They could not dismiss the devotion of the human, nor could they ignore the fire in her defiance. She had been told she was too big for love, yet here stood proof that she was not unworthy, not unloved, but chosen. And chosen not out of pity, but out of admiration, respect, and truth. That evidence shook the foundations of their belief. The elders tried to silence her, to remind the tribe of their traditions, but tradition faltered against the undeniable. She had found something beyond their narrow ideals. She had found love not in the sameness they clung to, but in the difference they despised. Her size, her strength, her very being, everything they had mocked, was the reason she was cherished. She did not beg them to understand. She did not need their acceptance. She declared her truth, and in doing so, freed herself from their chains. The confrontation ended not with victory carved in blood, but with silence heavy as stone. They could not touch her, not while she stood with unshakable conviction. They could not touch him, not while her shadow guarded him. And slowly, with no path left, they withdrew, their words hollow, their certainty fractured. She had not only defended herself, but had torn through the lie that had bound her all her life. When they were gone, she did not collapse into relief. She stood in the quiet, the human at her side, and felt a weight lift that she had carried since childhood. The voices of her people might linger, but they no longer defined her. She had found her worth not through their approval, but through her own acceptance, and through the unwavering gaze of someone who saw her clearly. For the first time, she realized she did not need to return to them. She did not need to beg for belonging among those who had rejected her. Belonging was already hers, found in the bond she had forged with the one who had fallen from the sky. They had said she was too big for love, but their words were wrong. She was not too big. She was exactly as she should be. And in the eyes of the human, she was perfect. The wilderness no longer felt like exile. It felt like home. Not because it was empty, but because she was no longer walking through it alone. The silence that had once haunted her was now filled with laughter, with stories, with a companionship she had thought forever lost. The path ahead was uncertain, the dangers of the world still real, but it no longer mattered. She had found what she had searched for all her life, not acceptance from those who had scorned her, but love that was true, unshaken, and real. And so she walked forward, not as an outcast, not as someone burdened by shame, but as someone free. Her people had named her too big for love, but in truth, she had simply been waiting for someone whose heart was vast enough to see her as she was. The human had shown her that worth was not given by a tribe, but recognized by a soul that truly saw. And in that recognition, she discovered that love had never been beyond her reach. It had only been waiting for her to find the eyes that would see her as perfect.